Due Process, honored for 3 consecutive years with the Mid-Atlantic Emmy for Outstanding Talk Program Series.
Churches, they're already getting government funds to run social service programs, but they're not allowed to push religion or discriminate. Are those safeguards about to disappear with a massive increase in federal funds? President Bush's faith-based initiative, coming up on Due Process.
Major funding for Due Process is made possible by the New Jersey State Bar Foundation, committed to educating the public about the law. Additional funding is provided by Lawyer's Diary and Manual.
The First Amendment, it isn't just about free speech, it's also about freedom of religion, separation of church and state, something some say could be threatened by the president's proposed policy on charitable funding. I'm Raymond Brown, and on the docket for this Due Process, the controversial faith-based initiative, the plan to give federal dollars to churches in a new and different way. For some religious groups, it looks like an answer to a prayer, but even some faith-based are now starting to cry foul. The debate over President Bush's plan coming up right here in the studio. But first, here's Sandy King to say there have been a few surprises on the faith-based front. Sandy?
Raymond, it was one of the president's earliest moves, intended perhaps to cement his ties to the Christian evangelicals. Still, they so far have been among the unconvinced on a plan that could have impact on billions of federal dollars. Bush surely expected opposition from the left. He may have been less prepared for what he's hearing from the churches, including some who've been doing social service for decades.
The cake we could slice right up.
A typical day in this kitchen within a church, where the food is intended for the body, not the soul. It's St. John's Catholic Church, and on this day alone, it will feed hundreds of Newark's hungry and homeless.
People would start knocking at the rectory door, telling that they were hungry and could they have a sandwich. And it just evolved into the line of 600 to 800 meals that we serve today, 5 days a week.
And all without a dime of government money.
Our funding comes from approximately 9,000 individual donors. We don't take any federal money, we don't take any church funds.
And nearly everyone who makes this program work is here as a volunteer.
That was about 150 pounds of cheese that was donated.
And when the president talks about funding faith-based, church-based social service programs, St. John's might be just the kind of place he has in mind.
As long as it's going to this type of cause, I think it's excellent.
But St. John's wants no part of the new Bush plan or the dollars it would bring. The fear here is that federal funds would mean federal interference.
I like to see the stuff come in the door and go out to the people that it should go out to, without any bureaucracy involved.
Some other churches, including parts of the Christian right, are less worried about the bureaucratic strings than the potential handcuffs they see on how they run their church business.
I've been surprised to see religious leaders like Pat Robertson and others come out against this.
But on the other side of the political spectrum, there's another kind of fear, that the Bush faith-based initiative will further blur the separation between church and state.
It creates a coercive effect, forcing individuals to participate in church activities in order to get social services that are paid for with federal tax dollars that belong to all of us with all our different beliefs.
It is government-sponsored bigotry on the basis of religious grounds. It is the only place where funds are distributed not on skills, not on talent, not on need, but on thought.
Of course, there's nothing new about church-sponsored social services getting government funds. Witness the massive national programs of the Salvation Army and Catholic Charities and their smaller local counterparts.
Thank you.
These after-school enrichment sessions are just one piece of the government-assisted programs run by St. Matthew AME Church, starting with a state and federal-sponsored Welfare to Work Job Training Center.
It's not in programs. You have to go into my document.
Making churches like St. Matthew a part of the effort to move welfare mothers into employment was allowed for in the 1996 federal overhaul of welfare and endorsed by a state initiative here in New Jersey, but only with some strict controls.
What we do here on our Neighborhood Improvement Development Association has nothing to do with what we do on Sunday morning with our Sunday school program. They're like apples and oranges.
The difference is that under the current system we have is that religious organizations provide the social services but cannot proselytize. Under Bush's initiative, proselytizing would be could be part of the services provided.
You will put your address and stuff up under there.
St. Matthew runs its social service programs under a separate community development corporation, housed in a separate building.
There's no mixture. We're a Christian-based program in the sense that our principles are Christian-based as the people who run this program. But when you come here, we're not making you go to church.
The big question now, will all that change with a Bush initiative that may be looking more kindly on the merging of tax-supported social services with what churches are really all about?
And it is going to open the floodgates to religious proselytization on the federal dime.
Yes, that kind of proselytizing is an issue because nobody wants that quid pro quo.
And secular programs like this food pantry up in Bergen County are wondering how they might feel the impact.
It's very, very tricky, and it's something that has to be, there is no black and white.
While the churches are lining up to opt out.
It's much better operation when it comes from individuals like yourself.
Or cash in.
It's a social thing, it's a moral thing, it's a right thing to do. And the government cannot do it all. And if you can identify a group like NIDA who is doing the work and some other groups, if they're doing the work, then help us to do the work. Help us to do what you cannot do.
D! Come on, everybody. Gladiator boards, let's go, Gary. D!
And St. Matthew is surely the kind of church that the president had in mind. But what about Scientology and its program for fighting drug addiction? Or the Nation of Islam and its rehab work in prisons? Reverend Moon or the Hare Krishnas? Would they all be in line for the federal funds? That specter creating still more consternation. And though the president may have been expecting smooth sailing, it is all adding up to rough waters, Raymond, for the faith-based initiative.
Well, will the plan be capsized? And even if it's not, can it survive the constitutional challenge it's almost sure to face? Some contrasting conclusions in just a minute, so stay with us.
When you mix church and state, you get in trouble.
Well, some of them do very good work, and a lot of them, they don't have a lot of funding, you know.
While there's that issue of separation of church and state, I could see the logic of trying to assist people that are doing a good thing.
I might be concerned that if the objective was to take that money to sell a particular religious point of view.
Some churches, not all churches, and it's okay as long as it's going to good use.
Somebody has to help us. Somebody has to help these churches. So I definitely think it's a good move.
Why not? The church is very helpful especially for the kids.
I don't see any way you can enforce it, that they won't crisscross church and state. I mean, if the nun hands out soup, is there going to be like a cop there to stop the nun from praying over it, from saying grace? It's impossible.
Will religion and government prove too close for comfort? Who would get the federal dollars and at what cost? There are still lots of unanswered questions about how the faith-based initiative would work. Will the devil be in the details? For some answers, we turn to Mark Stern, General Counsel of the American Jewish Congress, and Reverend Dwight Gill, whose Black Ministers Council has great hopes for the Bush plan. And in Newark, Andrew P. Napolitano. We call him judge because he's a former respected Superior Court judge here in New Jersey and now judge of his own TV show. Welcome to all of you.
Thank you, Ray.
Mark Stern, let me start with you. Everybody knows, or at least I think many people focused on the issue, that for several years in New Jersey and around the country, religious organizations have been in a position to deal with federal money. What is it about this initiative that raises constitutional and other issues on the part of those who are opposed?
What's different about the new faith-based initiatives is they don't require that the programs be entirely secular. Until now, the understanding has been religiously related programs can get government money if the programs are entirely secular. What President
And
Bush,
by secular, what are the particulars of that? What do they have to do or not do?
Well, they have to run it the way any secular organization would run it. There's no proselytizing, no prayers in the program, no religious discrimination in admission to the program or in employment in people who are running the program.
Would those things change under the new initiatives as you understand?
Indeed, and we have some of them already in law, and they specifically permit discrimination in employment, in hiring. They specifically permit the program to have religious components integrated into the component as long as they're nominally paid for privately. And that, in my organization's view, is a radical change from what went on before.
Reverend Gill, doesn't it trouble you that there would be under this plan the possibility of groups proselytizing or even discrimination? For example, if you ran a program, would you be comfortable with the idea that one could, in your program or another, discriminate against people on the basis of faith in hiring?
I don't think that there would be a major discrimination any more than what's already occurred. Proselyting and making sure that religion is carried out with the faith-based initiative is something that's already being done with federal dollars. Might not be done publicly, but it's awful hard to feed a hungry person, and that person is now aligned to who just fed him. He wants to come back and get more.
But the difference would be that now a person, for example, could say, if you don't join my sect, we won't hire you to work in this program, or perhaps we won't feed you. I mean, you will now get a benefit only in exchange, and we're using federal dollars to do that. Doesn't that raise problems even for people who are greatly concerned about faith?
Yes, that raises problems if there's going to be that broad spread discrimination. But really, the church has been doing faith-based ministry ever since it's begun, and it has did very well in deciding who gets what and help those who are in need. We could do a much better job than welfare or social services has already done, because we can make sure that the bureaucracy that's there is not there any longer. You can get more money to the people and less money to caseworkers and social workers and cars and buildings and office buildings and desks. You can get food, clothes, and shelter for people who really need it.
All right, let me draw Judge Napolitano into the fray. Judge, is there any possibility that the kind of program that it looks like coming out of Washington can avoid serious constitutional challenge in the courts?
I don't think there's any possibility that it can avoid serious challenge, and the question is, what test will the Supreme Court apply to this program to determine whether it's constitutional? There's the standard Lemon test, which comes from a case called Lemon against Kurtzman, and that says when the federal government spends money, when any government spends money on a church, it has to be for a secular purpose, there has to be a secular effect, and there cannot be entanglement between the government and the church.
But is it also fair to say that scholars differ in their analysis of how the court applies that test?
Absolutely, absolutely. For example, there's a dissenting test called the Aid to the Enterprise test, which says any money that goes to any church violates the First Amendment because it frees up money that the church has to spend on other things. So, for example, when the federal government gave the Archdiocese of Newark $10 million to build Seton Hall Law School, the argument would be that freed up that $10 million they would otherwise have spent on the law school to spend on religious matters, and therefore might violate the First Amendment. The other side to that argument is because the federal government's check went directly to the contractors, the people who built the building, and not to the Archdiocese itself, and because inside that building is a law school and not a church, therefore, secular purpose, secular effect, no entanglement, and thus constitutional.
Since this area of the law obviously has generated great debate, does it surprise you that some faith-based organizations have been opposed on principle to the extension that the president proposes?
Well, I don't think that the faith-based groups that have turned it down have done so less on legal grounds much as it pains me to admit there are other than legal grounds for doing anything. But the fear that they will ultimately be controlled by the government. The golden rule, who has the gold rule, still pertains. And if it doesn't happen today or tomorrow under this administration,
but there could actually be a legal foundation to that concern. I mean, the Establishment Clause was in part designed to keep the government from favoring one group over another, so that groups that might be concerned about entanglement
and favoritism is built into this program because the program allows the government to decide who's going to get the contract. In New Jersey, in fact, our program is very unstructured, and what you have is the government deciding who's running a program that we want to fund. Well, that allows for all sorts of religious choices to be made under the guise of this is the best program available.
Well, that's another problem, Ray, because under the prevailing Supreme Court opinions, when the government is giving money for secular purposes, it cannot favor religious over non-religious. It can make a distinction on the basis of who will use that money more efficiently, but it can't make a distinction on the basis of we're going to give that money to the church because we want this to be faith-based, as opposed to some other organization which doesn't believe in God or doesn't proselytize.
And a church that's in an urban center with over 80,000 people, and there are hungry people there. I think that word secular fits very well there. You're not talking about religion when you're talking about hungry, when you're talking about homeless.
I thought I heard you say earlier that you felt that there were people giving out prayer along with meals or
well, I feel like the fact that I don't think that there's prayer given out with the meals, or just like the commercial said, some nun praying over the soap. But I do think that it is highly impossible for us to help the community without influencing the community. But the same thing applies with the secular dollars that the government gives.
Here's the theoretical
it still
question.
influences the community.
Between your influence in the community by your conduct, that is helping those in need,
and that's
versus influence by saying directly, this is a belief system.
No, it would be influencing by the conduct. Okay. And
but you don't need
the age-old parable, do unto others as you will have them to do unto you.
Mark?
But you don't need a new initiative to do that. That's the current law. And so the question is, what does a new initiative bring to the table? And what it brings to the table is explicitly what you say is not necessary. And the question is then, why do you need the initiative?
The new initiative does this. Right now, the only way you can get federal dollars or state dollars is that you have to be a 501(c) organization. What the new initiative says is that you don't have to be a 501(c).
And the purpose of that organization was to keep the religious organization
separate
from the activity.
Exactly, but
what's the problem with
most of your smaller denominations that are really affecting and in the war zones, as I would say, it takes them years to get together and put together 501(c).
But that's the constitutional rub. That's the constitutional rub, because if the faith-based organization, in addition to providing a secular service like food, is also trying to proselytize and pray with these people, that is a clear violation of standard classic Supreme Court jurisprudence on the Establishment Clause, which says it cannot have a religious involvement. It's got to be the secular activities of a religious church.
But
the religious activities of a religious church.
But if I feed 500 people next week, and all 500 people, no religion involved, and all 500 people decide to show up at church Sunday morning, have I violated the law?
No, you would not have violated the law. But if the law, as the fellow in the street says, if the law allows the nun to pray with the person receiving the food, or allows the nun to say, as a condition for receiving this food, you have to say the Hail Mary, then that law would violate the First Amendment clearly.
So we get to the point where you got to split half of the soap. What part is financed by the government, what part is financed by the religious organization, and that part I can pray over?
But that's precisely the argument, that if you do it together, no matter how you allocate the money, it looks like the government together with the church spreading the church's faith. If you set up a separate corporation, which any lawyer can do in about 5 minutes with a computer, and you keep that program that gets the government funds entirely segregated and secular, you can do whatever you want in the church program. Nobody's saying you can't. But the government is only funding the religious program. That's what the bare minimum of what the Constitution has to do.
Not only with federal dollars do strings come, but restrictions come. The federal government may say, for example, you not only may discriminate, you must discriminate. You can only serve those people who welcome the religion that you're preaching. That would violate the First Amendment. Even saying you may preach to them while you are feeding them would probably violate the First Amendment if the federal dollars were used to buy the food.
Reverend Gill, what isn't clear to me is whether you're saying that there is a balance that needs to be struck in terms of preserving the separation of church and state, or you're saying that is too abstract a value to hold on to in the face of the good that you think would be done otherwise.
It's
I'm not
too
sure which way it
abstract
is.
a value to hold on to in the face of the good that will be done. If we continue to try to, in our effort to continue to try to separate church and state, we're continuing to lose people.
Right. Now, I know Reverend Gill for a long time, and he's an independent thinker. Is what he articulated there similar to the White House position, essentially, that this is so important, a useful social thing?
No, I think the White House goes further. The White House says that there are programs in which religion is indispensable to the success of the program. It's not merely that there's a sort of bureaucratic difficulty within the church in getting the paperwork done, which I understand Reverend Gill to be making. The White House is arguing that there's a redemptive, salvational factor to religion that no secular entity can bring to the table.
For a direct confrontation.
We are already in court in several places challenging such programs.
So let's look at the school dollars, the dollars that are spent in religious schools, and you're going to say that the schools that these dollars are spent in don't teach some form of religion?
They may not teach some form
but they can't get government money and do it.
Absolutely. When religious schools receive money, whether it be Seton Hall Law School or St. Margaret Mary Flower Pot Church, whatever it may be, they can only teach secular subjects with that money.
But they can offer any
courses
courses they
like. The White House may be right that there is a redemptive quality to religious involvement in social programs that only a religion can bring. But the First Amendment doesn't let the federal government pay for that.
Incidentally, I mean, that's the assumption that there's this factual assumption that there's a redemptive factor that only religion brings to the table is entirely unsupported by any empirical evidence.
But that has been one of the arguments.
It's a matter of faith that the president has said that, but it's not.
Let me get to another issue about where this lies. One question I would ask of you is that almost Vice President Lieberman has been a strong supporter of the initiative. Does he represent a larger constituency within the Jewish community, or is he out there by himself in terms of being a supporter of it?
The overwhelming majority of the Jewish community supports a fairly strict separation of church and state. There is a segment of the Jewish community that agrees with Senator Lieberman that religious institutions ought to be funded as religious institutions, which is what the battle is about.
Now, Reverend Gill, let me ask you, you're not Pat Robertson. I want to make that clear. But Pat Robertson, Jerry Falwell, and some who one might have expected to support this initiative have attacked it, saying, we don't want funds going to non-Christian groups. Has it surprised you to hear that critique, and what do you make of it?
Well, I think I like the word faith-based ministry, and I think that faith-based initiative, because I think what we need to realize here is the baby, not the bathwater, and understand that Muslim community and the Jewish community and the Christian community can help people that fall under categories that would have otherwise not been helped.
Let me throw this in Judge Napolitano's lap, who I know to be not just a fine lawyer, but a man of faith. Are the Scientologists, are the Hare Krishnas, are groups, is there a clear definition of what constitutes religious faith that will enable the courts to unravel this?
Well, that's the problem, and I agree with our colleague on the panel. The problem is that the government cannot favor religious over non-religious. In fact, we can't even agree on what the word religious means. So for the government to say, and I'm sure that Reverend Gill's church does a lot of good and can do a lot more good with federal dollars, but for the government to say we're only going to give to churches that are part of mainstream churches, excludes those that are not part of mainstream, and allows the government to make a distinction on the basis of thought and belief that the federal government, that the Constitution prohibits the government from making.
Well, does the Nation of Islam get money for its prison programs?
That I can answer.
But is it a religion?
It is a religion.
Okay. So in that context, could it be discriminated against if there's going to be money for religion?
Not that I can see.
And yet you can imagine the political furor that would evolve. In fact,
the Church of the Creator is the mirror image of the Nation of Islam, and you'd have the same thing. You'd have hate groups of various stripes getting government money.
I think instead of deciding what religions to give it to, it's decide again what the judge, I think I hear him saying, is that it's used for a specific kind of issue. That if it's going to be used for homeless, food,
but if it
and things of
involves,
that nature.
if there's a religious involvement in that process, how do you stay away from dealing with what one religion
And you're not
versus
funding everybody who comes knocking at the door and asks for government money.
If it's strictly secular, if the purpose is secular, if the effect is secular, and if the cop is not there to make sure that the nun is
Judge,
not
we're running out of
praying.
time. Can you give me a yes or no? Will we be arguing this issue 5 years from now?
Yes.
Reverend Gill?
No.
Mark?
Yes, I hope so. I'm
Well,
living doing it.
you'll all be invited back because we'll be here to try to wrestle with it. It's an important issue. I want to thank you each for being with us.
Thank you for
Reverend
having
Gill,
me.
Mark,
Pleasure,
Judge
Ray.
Napolitano.
Thank you.
That's it for this edition of Due Process, but we'll be back next week with another inside look at a cutting-edge issue of law and social justice. Till then, for Sandy King and all of us here, I'm Raymond Brown. Thanks for watching.
Do not have a system by which people are required to believe anything. We are allowed to think for ourselves, and to have the government funding intertwined with religious belief means that people lose that religious freedom. They lose that freedom to believe in what they want.
Faith-based initiatives, that type of funds, help us to bring in qualified people, help us to expand our space. You see how we operating upstairs. Every computer was full, every classroom chair is full. So we're ready to grow, and faith-based initiative will help us in that growth process.
Major funding for Due Process was made possible by the New Jersey State Bar Foundation, committed to educating the public about the law. Additional funding was provided by